Definers, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Scott and I are here defining sustainability, one topic and one bad joke at a time. This is episode 74 on transparency and sustainability. So Scott, let's get shaken. What is this episode going to look like?
All right, let's be transparent here about the outline. So what is transparency? What is the importance of transparency and sustainability? What are the expectations of key stakeholders like investors, consumers, and employees around transparency and sustainability? Is there guidance and rules around sharing sustainability information and performance? Then we'll get into what level of transparency exists in sustainability information, and then examples. Good examples, not so good examples of transparency and sustainability.
And Scott, lest we forget our interviewees here on this episode. We've got Dan Saccardi, Program Director, Company Network at Ceres. And we have Kathy Mulvey, Accountability Campaign Director, Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists.
So first, Jay, what is transparency?
So, Sustain Lab, a sustainability management platform, defines data transparency as the practice of making data easily accessible and understandable to all. Transparency simply is sharing data or information with your stakeholders, both internal and external to the organization. Transparency and disclosure is a key principle for other sectors and not just for sustainability, but today's conversation is focused on how businesses are tackling this topic.
All right, so businesses, historically, they've been pretty guarded with their information. Many companies did this because they believed their information was trade secret. Others didn't want questions from external stakeholders about their operations or data. Lately, however, there has been a shift toward businesses reporting more than ever, especially on the topic of sustainability. Many companies are taking this to new levels by sharing detailed information and data beyond legal requirements and making it freely available to everyone.
Transparency for businesses, however, isn't just simply reporting on whatever you feel like. Nielsen IQ research states that transparency on sustainability involves companies sharing details about their products or services. What are their ingredients? How are they manufactured? What is the impact, positive and negative, on people and the environment? It also involves being forthright and honest about the business's performance on environment, social, and governance topics, both internally and within its supply chain.
So Jay, we talked about how transparency, like the definition was just sharing data information, but there's clearly good and there's bad. And are you sharing the right information? We'll get more into this, but at its base, transparency is just sharing info. But like you said, you can't just share whatever you want.
Perfect segue, Scott. Tell us, what is the importance of transparency in sustainability specifically?
Right. So you may be asking yourself, Definer, why are we talking about this? Why is it important for companies to be transparent? Well, World Favor, a global sustainability platform that helps companies drive sustainability and transparency within the value chain, presents four main reasons as to why corporate transparency is needed. The first is that transparency helps everyone better understand reality. There's that age-old saying, knowledge is power. Well, the more that companies know about their footprint and environmental impacts, the easier it is to make meaningful, data-driven sustainability decisions.
Next, transparency can help motivate corporate action. Knowing and understanding where the baselines are can help to move entire industries along. Companies are forced to take action and be proactive when they lay out all of their cards on the table. Simply put, transparency equals accountability. Third, World Favor, and Scott, I always want to read this as World Flavor, I'm sure it tastes great, asserts that transparency is necessary for consumer trust. We'll talk about this a lot more coming up in a bit, but there are trends that show that consumers have their eyes on companies more than ever, especially when it comes to sustainability. Consumers today are very interested in company values and actions towards sustainability, and they want to be informed.
Right. So currently, businesses seem to actually be performing pretty well on trust. The 2022 Edelman Trust Barometer showed that business has become the most trusted institution, 61% saying I trust it, followed by NGOs, 59%, and governments, 52%. The media, only 50%. And I don't know, Jay, if this surprised you.
Kind of, sorta. I don't know. I mean, media these days is different to every person, so.
I thought government would be lower, actually. And maybe NGOs would be higher?
You know,
Or maybe they're seen as biased on their own little topics.
Yeah, I mean, I still looked at that 52% with governments. I was like, oh, that could be a little better. But,
Totally.
know.
So businesses are in the lead, but if they're seen as non-transparent, that trust score could falter and they could lose business too. So recent research shows that more than 80% of shoppers want to buy from brands with values that align with their own. And we're going to talk more about transparency and how it can affect purchasing.
Right. And last but not least, transparency can lead to collaboration and cooperation. Transparency often leads to collective action, and as we know, complex issues like climate change and addressing supply chains cannot be addressed alone. So, to summarize this section, Scott, we talked about a lot of good stuff. Transparency is needed to understand the current reality, motivate corporate action, earn consumer trust, and foster collaboration and cooperation. A lot of good things in there.
Yeah.
Now, let's move on and ask, what are the expectations of key stakeholders like investors, consumers, and employees around transparency in sustainability?
Right. So there's a growing demand for more data disclosure. Stakeholders like the ones you mentioned, consumers, investors, employees, driving forces for corporate transparency. Let's look at the expectations and demands around transparency with each of these groups. So let's start with consumers. They've become more and more educated over time, and the demand for transparency is growing as they become more critically aware of issues like climate change, social inequalities, and biodiversity. It's not just enough for companies to put recycling labels on there and vague claims around the product's performance or broad statements about a commitment to diversity and inclusion. They have to have data to back up these claims and about the progress they're making.
Transparency, or lack thereof, is making a true impact on purchasing decisions for today's average consumer.
See, I said we'd get there to this.
That's right. And Scott, we have arrived. Welcome, folks.
As promised.
2022 Sustainability Transparency Research from Nielsen IQ notes that almost 2 out of 3 shoppers say they would switch from a brand they normally buy to another if there is more in-depth product information, even if that information is not on the label, but on a company website or social media. Consumers often are turning to the internet to learn more about companies and their products before making purchasing decisions. While price and affordability still remain high priorities for consumers in choosing what to buy, the consumers surveyed in this study next ranked environmental and sustainability credentials alongside social responsibility, ingredients, and supply chain.
Right, so not to get, I feel like people sometimes say this, sustainability is so important, but price and affordability still king.
Yes.
So you can't just charge a whole bunch and say, well, but it's sustainable for XYZ reasons. You still got to be competitive on price. Surveys that say people are willing to pay more, I don't know if I necessarily buy it, particularly not a lot more. But certainly if you're seen as not transparent and that your product is hurting people, people will just go to another product and maybe that has a similar price.
Totally.
All right, so we saw a lot of this pressure for accountability from consumers via social media just a couple years ago on social justice issues. We want to talk about one example here. It's called Pull Up for Change. It was a grassroots social media campaign launched in 2020. It called for companies, beauty brands specifically, to be transparent about the demographics of Black and brown people at the corporate and executive levels. Sharon Chuter, she was a beauty executive herself. She saw all of these bold statements companies were putting out in support of diversity within their organizations, but then she couldn't easily find data disclosed anywhere from those same companies about tangible actions. So she went to social media, and she garnered the support of hundreds of thousands of consumers who demanded that those companies who put out a statement become more transparent and release statistics on diversity and inclusion at the employee and executive level. And she also challenged companies to disclose about their donations and partnerships with BIPOC people and organizations. As a result, companies like Nike, Sephora, P&G Beauty, and others released more detailed information about their employee breakdowns for the first time in history. So this shows the power of consumers demanding transparent information. The company will disclose, but oftentimes it's not just a proactive volunteer thing. They got to feel a bit of pressure.
Totally. And in keeping with that company perspective, being more transparent not only provides that brand loyalty and trust, but it can also bring you more consumers if they see a certain company leading and have tangible evidence that the company's values align with those of their own. I think this is interesting, Scott, to kind of articulate all of these like subconscious things you're thinking about as you're choosing between the products you want to buy. But I think it's really nice to lay these all out here.
Yeah.
So we've talked consumers. Let's now turn to investors who, like the consumers, are seeking more information about the companies they're investing in and using public data to fuel where they put their money. For the big institutional investors like Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, transparency and reporting from their portfolio companies is no longer optional, as they want sustainability data to assess the risk and opportunities companies pose to their investments.
So, Jay, you mentioned one company there, BlackRock, huge company. They have $10 trillion in assets under management, and it's gathering data for its clients. It wants investors to have full visibility into the sustainability risks of their investments, but providing information such as sustainability scores and carbon footprint information for each company under their purview. So investors are saying, be transparent with us, give us data so we can make investment decisions. For those listeners interested in making their investments more in line with sustainability, check out episode number 65. It's on personal sustainable investing.
One of my favorites.
Good to know.
Yeah, along with the other 72 we've produced.
They're all our babies. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Scott, you never forget your first, do you?
Did I tell you, I read a biography, Jay, about George Washington, and the title was You Never Forget Your First. And it was by a female biographer. It was like the first George Washington biography written by a female biographer. So that was an interesting perspective. Yeah.
I love it. All right. So we've talked consumers, we've talked investors. Let's go internal now and talk about the employees at these companies. So employees are becoming an increasingly important stakeholder in transparency since they're starting to make decisions to work at a company based on its disclosures and performance. One UK study found that 77% of people want the company they work for to be more transparent about environmental impact. Many employees don't believe that their employer has genuine or impactful sustainability initiatives, but wish they would.
Further, the 2022 Global Gen Z and Millennial Survey from Deloitte found that the Gen Z and Millennial generations, they're especially pushing for climate action within their organizations. Over 40% of both groups have put pressure on their employer to take action on fighting climate change. They overwhelmingly do not want to work for companies that are lagging on addressing key environmental and social issues. Further research from Deloitte found that 65% of business leaders are feeling the need to act on sustainability and transparency due to pressure from employees. So they want to keep their employees happy, but you got to show that your actions are genuine.
Bill Weil, former sustainability lead at Facebook, started Climate Voice a couple of years back to proactively engage employees at big companies on how they create pressure from the inside out to act on climate. Employees making their transparency demands clear can lead to changes in disclosure. Consider when over 8,500 employees wrote an open letter to Jeff Bezos and the Amazon board of directors in 2019, calling for the adoption of a new company-wide climate action plan. The employees did not believe that Amazon was doing enough to address the climate crisis, so they banded together, asking their leaders to do more and publish more information about sustainability. As a result of that effort, Amazon released its 2018 carbon footprint publicly and has continued to do so in the years since.
Jay, it's another good example here of collective pressure, be it from consumers or employees. It can make change.
Scott, I would call that a prime example of employee action.
Oh, jeez. Nice. All right. So in short, good transparency, we would say it's good business because these key stakeholders, consumers, employees, investors, they all want to see it. So is there guidance and rules around sharing sustainability information and performance? Jay, this is our next topic.
I'm just going to say yes, and we can move on, Scott. No. Okay. So definers, the call to action is pretty clear. Businesses should identify the areas of sustainability most important to their stakeholders and communicate actions, strategy, and progress in these areas transparently. But what guidance and rules exist on how they communicate and what needs to be disclosed? Well, many reporting standards and frameworks exist for sustainability. And while we won't go into all of them here, which could be an entire episode of its own, it's most important to note that the majority of these reporting standards are voluntary, meaning companies don't have to engage on sustainability topics at all if they don't want to. However, research into the S&P 500 showed that 93% of companies issue some sort of ESG or sustainability report using at least one framework or standard. So quickly, let's look at two of the common voluntary reporting frameworks that companies use. Scott, start us off.
I will do that, Jay. I just want to go back to what you said about it being voluntary. It definitely is. But as you just mentioned, most every company does it. It's more a matter of, are they doing it well?
Totally.
And we'll get more into what's good and not good. But yeah, it's kind of table stakes to be communicating what you're doing on sustainability. But some give more info and some do it better than others. So in terms of these reporting frameworks that are voluntary, one is GRI, or Global Reporting Initiative. It's a global reporting standard that follows a multi-stakeholder process that helps companies be more transparent about their impacts. Over 10,000 companies across the globe use this framework to share their sustainability risks, opportunities, and progress. You often see in sustainability reporting, oh, this was in line with GRI. Another reporting framework is CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. This framework is an investor-led organization that allows both companies and governments to disclose their environmental impacts and take action. Over 13,000 companies typically respond to CDP questionnaires annually, and we'll get into that. There's many companies that also don't. But in 2022, over 680 investors representing $130 trillion in access requested company disclosures via the CDP platform.
Right. So the CDP framework not only allows for disclosure, but it also uses the data that is supplied from companies to score the companies from A to F on each target area. There is some competitive pressure then from companies in the same industry or sector to perform well each year as the letter grades are made public for companies on the CDP website.
Like, Jay, you've probably seen there's press releases where the companies say, oh, we got A's on climate and water and this and that. So it's definitely something companies tout.
Totally. And I will say, Scott, like I've felt that sense of competition directly with our sustainability team saying, okay, what are our competitors doing and how can we stay ahead of the pack where we all want to be? So I think it encourages absolutely that healthy competition. Now,
and they just need to go to office hours, and just get the professor, play the game.
Yeah, just deliver an apple as well, and like, boom, there's your.
Yeah.
All right. So, 87% of companies that responded to the CDP survey in 2021 noted that their disclosure within the platform helped their organization become more transparent about environmental impact. So a lot of good things coming from participating in these kinds of programs.
Right, Jay, that goes back to what we were saying earlier about knowledge is power, where these companies are saying, yeah, I had to disclose. Yeah, I opened myself up to some risk, maybe getting a bad grade, but also the process might have actually delivered some insights for me I otherwise would not have identified.
Absolutely.
All right, so we talked about these standards and frameworks, but certifications are another way that companies can increase transparency with their stakeholders. Underneath many labels, though not all, there is credibility via data, performance requirements, and third-party validation. Some certifications you may have seen are Forest Stewardship Council, Cradle to Cradle, and Green Seal. While the frameworks and certifications we've discussed, they're voluntary, the legal and regulatory landscape is evolving to where sustainability disclosure will be required of certain companies.
And to that end, Scott, our European friends are leading the way.
As they tend to do.
As they tend to do. Anna and I are currently watching a season of Great British Bake Off, so I feel especially close to our friends overseas. Okay.
One of my friends told me about this show, Is It Cake? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think I actually do. I haven't watched it, but I think I know what you're talking about.
So it's just the whole show is the people guess whether the thing is a cake or not a cake. Like, like a street sign. Is it? Yeah. And then they cut it dramatically to show whether it's a cake or not.
I was hoping the reveal has to be all right, the judge has to sink their teeth into it and maybe it's a piece of cake or maybe it actually is a metal street sign.
That sounds dangerous, Jay.
And very unpleasant.
Yeah, I don't think you'd get good celebrity guests with that one.
All right. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, is a policy requiring large companies who operate in the EU to disclose their sustainability and ESG information annually. This policy, adopted in 2022, builds on existing legislation providing detailed reporting requirements for companies around the environment, human rights, and social standards. The policy goes further and details that companies will also need to undergo audit and certification schemes to ensure that the information they are providing is reliable and outlines that there must be digital access to the sustainability information that is required. Compliance with this regulation will be required for all large companies and even non-EU companies with significant activity in the EU. These new regulatory rules will begin to be rolled out in 2024.
It's pretty intense, Jay, right? Audit and certification schemes,
Totally.
Digital access, all large companies, including non-EU companies doing significant activity. So they're not messing around.
You got to step up to play ball.
Okay, so in the U.S., many are following the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission's rulemaking process around climate disclosure. The rule is set to enhance and standardize how companies report on climate-related risks, emissions, and net zero transition plans. A lot of attention has been on whether the SEC will require companies to disclose Scope 3, or supply chain emissions. If you're not sure about Scope 3 emissions, but you're Scope 3 curious, check out episode number 25 for more. There are some people who say...
One of my favorites.
One of your favorites? Yeah, exactly. And there are some people who say this SEC disclosure rule, it's going to come out, it's going to be challenged in the courts, it's just going to get tied up in the courts for years. So we'll see if it actually gets out and people actually follow it. Okay, so we talked about guidelines around voluntary and mandatory disclosure, but what about rules on how to communicate about what you're disclosing and marketing more generally? What about that, Jay?
Right. So here in the US, the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, Green Guides provide guidance to marketers on what claims are not deceiving under the FTC Act. For example, it explains when marketers can say a product has a certain third-party certification, a product is compostable, and if a product is recyclable. On that last point, for example, the FTC says a company can say a product is recyclable if 60% of consumers or communities where the product is sold have access to a recycling program that accepts that product. Now, keep an eye out for updates to the FTC Green Guides, as an announcement regarding a revisions process was made in December of 2022. All right. So, Scott, let's now ask what levels of transparency exist in sustainability information.
All right, so Jay, we've detailed why transparency is so important, what company stakeholders, consumers, investors, employees are looking for, and what guidance exists. But let's get to the heart of it, Jay. How transparent are companies in practice? Well, while some companies are leading the charge on transparency, some are refusing to put out any detailed metrics. Or they're making statements and then not backing them up with the metrics. So the lack of transparency is a result of a lack of collaboration, lack of data, and a lack of pressure from stakeholders. We gave those examples of pressure, but sometimes they're not organizing. They're not making clear what they want.
Right. All right, so Scott, we've arrived at what you alluded to earlier. So CDP, the reporting platform that we mentioned a bit ago, has 13,000 companies disclosing through their annual reporting mechanism. However, the organization notes that there are more than 29,500 companies that have failed to respond to their disclosure requests or have provided insufficient information. These include big guys like ExxonMobil and Tesla, but also smaller or privately held companies that don't have as much pressure to talk about their environmental progress externally.
To be fair, I mean, this CDP disclosure we're talking about, Jay, this is not a small task. It takes a lot of time to do. So if you are a smaller company, maybe you're like, I'm disclosing in the way I want to disclose. I don't really want to have to deal with this. So just putting that out there.
Very fair point.
But yes, some of these big companies, like the ones you mentioned, they don't want to go through the process. Either they don't want to be transparent, they don't want to be graded in this way. So we want more to do it, but of course CDP has a reason to say more people should be doing CDP. You know, there's other ways to be transparent.
More people should be listening to Sustainability Defined, Scott.
There you go. That's always my point at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, additionally, further research from CDP notes that while 49% of European companies report having an ambitious science-based climate transition plan in place, less than 5% actually disclose against most key indicators showing a credible plan exists. Further, the research found that up to 40% of all outstanding corporate loans to companies analyzed, 75% of the European stock market, currently finance companies without clear targets or evidence of developing credible transition plans. So the intent is there, but often there's not the data to back up the claims that these companies are making, which limits the transparency around climate action. So the stats that I just rattled off, I mean, Jay, I think it's interesting that this was a European focus, and there's not even the disclosure that needs to be there. So
Absolutely.
no doubt the U.S. performance isn't where it needs to be either. So putting out a climate transition plan is not enough. You got to have metrics within the plan and be willing to disclose those metrics year in and year out, even if it's not good.
Absolutely.
So speaking of not so good, Jay, let's get into our final topic here before introducing our expert guest. What are good and not so good examples of transparency and sustainability?
Right. So, Scott, we'll make clear a company desiring to increase transparency is one thing. It actually backing that up with facts, truth, and data is another.
I think we've said that a couple of times, Jay. That's really kind of the key point.
Absolutely. Now, talking a big sustainability game without backing it up could be labeled as greenwashing, a term that you've probably already likely heard, definers. The term was actually added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary and is defined as the act or practice of making a product, policy, activity, etc., appear to be more environmentally friendly or less environmentally damaging than it really is. It happens when environmental claims are presented with a lack of evidence to appear better for the environment.
There's many examples of greenwashing. We sought out an article that went through them. We found an Earth.org article with it. One example that stood out for us is from Nestle. So it released a report in 2018 saying that it had, quote, ambitions for its packaging to be 100% recyclable or reusable by 2025. Sounds nice, but it had no clear targets, timelines, or efforts to enhance consumer recycling access for that packaging. So Greenpeace put out a statement saying, quote, Nestle's statement on plastic packaging includes more of the same greenwashing baby steps to tackle a crisis it helped to create. It will not actually move the needle toward the reduction of single-use plastics in a meaningful way and sets an incredibly low standard as the largest food and beverage company in the world, end quote. Yes, very Greenpeace, bold, throwing daggers everywhere, but this sort of fear of shaming can make companies think twice about greenwashing. So it can hopefully help them toe the line towards good transparency.
That's right. And for those definers interested in the latest with Nestle, we will link in the show notes on sustainabilitydefined.com to a March 2023 Waste Dive article titled Inside Nestle's Long Road to Improve the Sustainability of Its Packaging Footprint. Now, interestingly, fear of attention on its actions is also one reason for the rise of what's been called green muting or green hushing. This is where companies undercommunicate their sustainability activities. A very interesting kind of offshoot there of this greenwashing idea.
Like, we want them to be transparent, but if they think they're just going to get attacked, then they're like, let's be less transparent or wait until we have full performance data and we're 100% rock solid.
Right. So, all right, Scott, we've talked a bit on perhaps what not so good transparency looks like. Mm-hmm. Let's ask what good sustainability communication looks like, and let's lean on our old friend Joel McCower from Green Biz to help us out. So, Joel suggests the CRED strategy will give you cred. Hi, classic McCower joke.
Yep.
In sustainability communication. So, CRED strategy, CRED, C-R-E-D, is an acronym standing for the following. C is for credibility. Why should anyone believe us? R is relevance. How can we leverage sustainability to create value? E is effective messaging. How do we translate complex data into compelling messages? And D is differentiation. Do we have unique goals and achievements? And boom, you've got a CRED strategy.
Right. So ultimately, transparency is about that sharing of information. So this CRED can be used to share that information credibly. All right. So we also found a 2022 journal article titled, quote, Do not forget the how along with the what, improving the transparency of sustainability reports, end quote. It offers up 4 stages of transparency: sharing, connecting, embedding, and co-creating. We especially liked its list of innovative reporting mechanisms and examples of each. Here's 2. One mechanism is traceable product level performance and impacts. An example is VF Corporation's traceability maps. You can see a product's global supply chain. This is like listing details for factories, textile mills, material suppliers, distribution centers. And key sustainability features are in the map too. These include energy and water efficiency, recycled materials, community, chemicals, as well as the date the information was updated. I like that too. So these traceability maps allow you to really get in the weeds on each of the products it creates, like Timberland shoes, for instance.
Right. Another mechanism is learning lessons and perspective. This 2022 journal article also notes H&M's sustainability disclosures all include learnings and future focus insights that highlight the negative impacts and challenges associated with their garments. One, for example, suggests that tools such as laundry bags do not provide a long-term solution to microfiber emissions. Quote, "We know we need to continue to research new materials and processes that prevent shedding rather than removing microfibers during the washing cycle." Interesting take there from H&M as a fast fashion company.
Jay, have you seen these bags where you can wash your clothes in the bags and then that helps remove the microplastics as you wash? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do, but I can't say I've seen them too many places. Have you?
Yeah, I bought one. I think it worked. It was a little confusing, but I appreciate H&M being kind of transparent here, being like, we still need to figure this out. It shouldn't be put on our consumer to use this special bag. Like, we got to figure out a way to make our clothes so that the shedding doesn't happen. I mean, it's like, thanks, but you're still creating the problem year in and year out, so get on that.
Totally. That's what I was going to say. I mean, that almost kind of goes back to that Nestle example. It's like, okay, great. Like, we can admit fault, but we can't, just stop there.
Yeah. We just took the example from the journal article, but I hope they have a plan to figure it out. Like, how much money are you putting towards solving the problem?
Right.
All right. So, in general, when you look at sustainability websites and report, and this is what we do too, look for clear depiction of goals with measurable targets and deadlines, as well as clear reporting on current status. One of the ones I like best are where they literally have like green light, yellow light, and red light, or achieved, in progress, or behind, where they're just, here's our goals, here's the most recent year's worth of data, and here's saying where we're at. Keep an eye out for that. That's, I think, good transparency to, your consumers who are busy. Just tell me what your goals are and where you're at. And don't get caught up in these very long, glossy reports, flowery language. Get down to what they're committing to, what kind of resources they're putting towards it, and where are they?
Wonderful.
Thanks, Jay.
All right, Scott, and let's introduce our 2 interviewees coming up in this episode. First, you'll hear from Dan Saccardi, Program Director, Company Network at Ceres. Ceres is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders who solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. The Ceres Company Network includes major corporations committed to driving sustainable business leadership by taking action to stabilize the climate, protect water and natural resources, and build a just and inclusive economy. By leveraging Ceres' unique access to investors, companies, and other advocacy organizations, Company Network members realize a competitive advantage by integrating stronger environmental, social, and governance practices into their core business strategies. A lot of good-sounding stuff. All right, so Dan joined Ceres in 2016. Before joining Ceres, Dan spent nearly 10 years at several sustainability strategy companies, working with companies in diverse industries. He started his environmental career at the nonprofit Natural Resources Defense Council. After Dan is an interview with Kathy Mulvey, Accountability Campaign Director, Climate and Energy Program at Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS. At UCS, Kathy leads strategic development of UCS's Climate Corporate Accountability Campaign, guides engagement with corporate targets, builds national and international coalitions, and mobilizes experts and supporters. Kathy has designed and led various corporate accountability initiatives, programs, and campaigns since 1989. In other words, basically as long as Scott and I have been alive. And in addition to her work at UCS, Kathy chairs the Socially Responsible Investing Committee for the Unitarian Universalist Association and serves on the board of Grassroots International. All right, without any further ado, let's go. All right, Definers, welcome to the interview portion of our episode on sustainability and transparency. We are super excited to be joined this morning by Dan Saccardi, the Program Director, Company Network at Ceres. So first off, Dan, before we dive in, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here and talk with you.
So let's start with your background. We saw that you earned your BA in Environmental Studies from Connecticut College. So would it be safe to say that you knew you wanted to do this sort of work from a very early age?
I always wanted to work in the sustainability field. I think well before I knew what the word sustainability meant, at least in this context. But how specifically that might have played out, I think it was hard to say. And certainly the various routes I've taken, I wasn't planning out in early age. But I did want to study and then work in the area of sustainability, the intersection of how we impact and are impacted by the environment.
I'd like to ask you a follow-up question here, because I think this is something that's at least a common question among our listeners, which is that of graduate degrees. So you also have an MBA and an MPA from NYU, a lot of acronyms there. Mm-hmm. Many of our definers are students or young professionals looking for career advice. So I'm curious, would you recommend one or perhaps both of those graduate degrees for those looking to work in sustainability and do the types of work that you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think particularly in this evolving landscape, I wouldn't recommend going to grad school simply for the sake of going, but I do think it makes a lot of sense, particularly if a student has a particular end in mind and feels that a graduate degree or degrees can help get you there. And that was certainly the case for me, where from my undergrad, I started on the nonprofit and environmental NGO side of the sustainability space. And I think one of the many lessons I learned from my time at the Natural Resources Defense Council was how pivotal a role the private sector plays in all of the sustainability issues, sometimes for better and sometimes for worse. And from where I was, I didn't feel like I had a deep understanding of the private sector. And so that's what really piqued my interest in the MBA part of my dual degree.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
At the same time, I saw myself maybe not immediately after grad school, but down the line, continuing my work on the NGO side. And so for me, the combination of the MBA and MPA made a lot of sense, and I think has worked out well. But that's not to say, obviously, that that's a path for everyone. And so I would just say that, think carefully about, what you're trying to do, what it takes to get you there. I am a believer in having a bit of work experience before going to grad school, because that can help really hone what you're looking to do, what grad school can help you get there, and realizing some programs that's less important, things like medical school or even law school. But I found a lot of value in the several years of work I had before going back to school.
You mentioned that you worked at nonprofits. I know you've also worked at some consultancies, which I'm sure the MBA came in handy there. So can you touch on one or two of your favorite sustainability experiences, accomplishments, lessons learned, some story or anecdote that you think our listeners would find of interest and learn from?
One, maybe I'll start with, comes from when I was working at the Wildlife Conservation Society, mm-hmm. which some folks may know better as the organization that runs the major zoos in New York City, including the Bronx Zoo. But they also have really important conservation programs all over the world. And so I worked with them for a year. And as part of that year, I spent a month in Rwanda working with their National Parks Agency.
Wow.
And in addition to being a really incredible experience personally, I think one of the things I took away from that experience was really the importance of knowing your audience, your constituencies. That the project I was working with their parks agency on was how to help raise revenue from their 3 national parks. And the answer wasn't simply increase revenue, but it was more about kind of differentiating what type of park goers were going to which parks for what reasons. And I think what we discovered is that 2 of the parks was really about attracting local Rwandans to visit. And so there was not about raising prices, but really about lowering them to make it more affordable for a day visit. And then the other park was the ones that people may be most familiar with, which had the mountain gorillas. And that's really a draw for the international vacationers and travelers. And so there was okay, let's really focus there on maximizing revenue and increasing fees there for more wealthy international travelers, while also having the ability for local Rwandans to visit those parks, but even the gorillas at a discounted rate. So I think the lesson there was about, it's not one size fits all. And it's important, and this is something that I think we've been doing a lot more recently in different contexts, it's important to bring along the communities that are most affected by the work. That's something in the context of environmental justice and climate justice in my current work, but I think was very important for that work too, that if the local communities don't feel invested, and in this instance about being able to access the parks, then they won't be as bought in to help protect them.
Sure.
Excellent. We'd like to go ahead and transition into your role at Ceres as we start wading further and further into this topic. So it sounds like, as you've alluded to, you're helping leading companies in a variety of ways to manage sustainability through the Ceres Company Network. Now, we gave a general description of Ceres Company Network in the intro, but could you please walk the listeners through a couple examples that are meaningful to you of how you've helped companies advance their sustainability work through the network?
Yeah, sure. So one example can point to is we've done some work with many of our companies, including in the food and beverage sector, one being General Mills, around greater transparency and detail in their disclosure. I think one thing we see from a lot of companies is that the instinct is to talk about what are some of the things that are going very well, and I think that's a natural inclination for a company to shine a light on successes. And I think one thing we tell many of our companies is that external stakeholders, ourselves, but also investors and policymakers and others, are looking for some candid conversation around what are the real challenges you're facing and what are you doing to address that. And I think an example that's come out in a disclosure recently from one of the companies who work with General Mills is around the challenges they're facing in dealing with scope 3 emissions. And those would be the indirect emissions from their value chain. So the emissions that the company themselves don't directly control.
I'm sure, Dan, everyone listening to this listened to our scope 3 episode.
That's right.
I should certainly hope they would.
Yeah.
Just in case, wanted to put that reminder that really deals with what's in their value chain, and that's something that they know, and they're not alone in this. It's really a common challenge for many companies. They know they need to get a handle on, but they don't have an exact blueprint of first how to measure those emissions, because again, they don't directly control them, and then how to reduce them. And so in their recent sustainability report, there's a bit there where they talk fairly candidly about some of the challenges that they're facing in doing that measuring of those emissions, as well as setting forward a plan that they can implement, and really that would need to work with their value chain partners and suppliers to implement in order to reduce those emissions. And with that comes how do you create the right methodology to address this. And the reason why this is interesting is that they have more kind of questions than answers, but being able to talk about that publicly is something that we think is really important, because these are complex issues, and if a company says they have it all figured out, then they're probably not looking deeply enough. Another example in a equally challenging but important sector is some of the work we've been doing in the financial services sector, and I guess an example that comes to mind in particular is with Citi, that your listeners are no doubt quite familiar with. But they have been doing a lot of work to disclose both the efforts they have in place, as well as the direction that they're going as it relates to their climate goals around a net zero commitment, and more importantly, the 2030 targets that they're putting in place to get there. And so they've disclosed, and some of the other banks have done this as well, they've disclosed specific sectors such as the auto sector, transportation more broadly, agriculture, and others where they're setting specific goals, oil and gas being an important one, to move those sectors by 2030 in order to get where they ultimately need to go by 2050.
Like within their portfolios, Dan?
Yes, exactly. So this isn't about reducing the electricity use in their offices, although all the major banks have those type of goals. But now what we've been seeing from folks like Citi and JP Morgan, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, and others is setting goals for the sectors that they're providing financing to how to reduce those what's called financed emissions, and that's really the crux of banks' overall emissions. Again, getting back to that Scope 3 point, that it's not really about their own headquarters and offices, but about the emissions that they're financing.
And are they being transparent about where their finance emissions are currently? And are they committing to update people every year, whatever, on the progress?
Yeah, so there is a good degree of, not company by company, but sector by sector, there's a good degree of disclosure about where the financing is going and what those associated finance emissions are, as well as setting goals, again, not company by company, but sector by sector to reduce those. And both that specific example of Citi, but the banks more broadly have, over the past several years, have been putting a lot of work and focus to first measure those finance emissions, and then set sector goals to reduce them by 2030, having emissions by 2030, broadly speaking, en route to net zero by 2050 or sooner.
Excellent.
Are there organizations, whether they're in your network or not, that you've seen companies do well in terms of transparency or not so well, where you're like, hey, you didn't really give the full story? Are there any examples there that you've seen that you want to mention to the listeners?
I may not go into a specific example of a company not doing as well as you would like, but I can say that what we look for, to the point you were just raising, is telling a holistic story about material issues. And so if we see a disclosure that has a lot of anecdotes and is about changing out the plastic forks in the cafeteria for compostable forks, which isn't to say that's not important, but if that's what a company is focusing on, then they're probably either not understanding or at least not disclosing what are their real material impacts and how are they setting strategy to address those. And so what we really look for is do they have an understanding of material issues that need to be addressed? Are they holistically looking at those issues? And are they, in addition to telling great success stories, and I think it's always important to do that because that helps build the case for how we can all get where we need to go, but are they also identifying what are the challenges? And that kind of goes back to the example I mentioned about General Mills, is that I think a good rule of thumb that we're always telling our companies is that if you're not talking about it, don't assume that your investors, your customers, even your employees think you're doing it. That you have to indicate, even if you don't have all the answers, you have to indicate, what is the direction that you're going.
That makes sense. But have you also found some companies, if they don't know where they're going or they're not sure how they're going to get there, have you heard from some companies being, well, I shouldn't talk about that because I could fail, or it's not as good as like there's this green hushing movement we talked about in the introduction. Have you seen any of that?
Yeah, it's a great point. And we certainly see that. And that certainly comes up that, what if we say we're going to do something, we don't have a clear plan for it, and we don't get there. Right. And I think we did see some of that in the lead up to 2020 when there were a lot of goal setting about zero deforestation that a lot of companies made. And there wasn't a clear plan or roadmap, if you will, to get there. And, we're sitting here in 2023 and those goals haven't been set. And so there's a balance to be struck there, that it's not enough simply to put out a goal without having a plan. But at the same time, if the act of putting the goal out there can help generate the impetus and organizational buy-in to develop the plan. So we see these as, neither one alone is sufficient, but they're both certainly necessary.
Right. And then I also imagine as people put out their targets or their plans, it also invites other stakeholders, like some of the nonprofits you worked for maybe in the past, to say, hey, you're not doing enough. and I'm going to bring attention that you're not doing that. So at Ceres, how do you work with or bring in or mobilize other stakeholders so that you get the action you're looking for, particularly in the context of transparency, because that's what we've been talking about. But if there's something outside transparency, that's fine. But that other stakeholders piece.
Yeah, and stakeholder engagement is a huge part of what we do in a variety of ways. Within the company network that I help lead, we do that through stakeholder engagements where we bring together a dozen or so of the key stakeholders for a company, usually made up of investors, peers, or customers, as well as other interested civil society members.
Like for an individual company in the network, you'll bring their key stakeholders together for them?
Correct. So,
okay.
A dozen or so. So we would convene a private, candid, couple of hour conversation with a dozen or so of their stakeholders, again, made up from investors, customers, sometimes peers, if it's appropriate, and certainly other civil society members, to provide some of that expectation that you were mentioning. It's great to put out goals. It's great to have a report, but is that providing the necessary transparency? Is that providing the necessary level of detail? Does it have the right level of ambition to what we're more about? Are you really striving for the right impact? And then do you have a plan to execute that? And so while those are private conversations, we see that the fruits of those conversations make their way out into sustainability disclosures in areas like talking about challenges or talking about areas that the company hasn't figured out, but the directions that they're looking to go, or taking on a more holistic look at material issues. So that's one way we work with stakeholders. And then we also have an investor network, which is a sister network to the company network that's made up of over 200 asset owners and managers that are collectively managing 60 trillion plus in assets. And we help bring them to bear to say, we as shareholders of company X, Y, and Z, our expectation is that you set these goals, that you have these implementation plans. And so that, again, involves private conversations, but also public expectations. So for some of your audience may have heard of Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a network of global investors, even larger in scale, 700 or so, with almost 70 trillion in assets. And those are working with the 160 or so largest greenhouse gas emitters to very specifically develop transition plans, increase their transparency of their disclosure, increase their level of oversight for sustainability issues with a big focus on climate.
Yeah, it's interesting because I feel like with transparency, we've mainly been talking about how well they're doing in their sustainability reports and on their social media accounts, things like that. But then to think about these private meetings and how transparent they are there, and creating that space for people to be transparent so that we can be candid with each other, and then you get the outputs you were talking about based on that transparency that otherwise wouldn't have happened. Hadn't really thought about that before, or at least in this episode. It makes total sense that it's not just about what you're proclaiming to everybody, but also what you're doing in different spaces.
Yeah, it's a big part of our theory of change. And, for us, that can't remain that level of transparency just behind closed doors. That it's important to have those conversations in ways that you can publicly. But our expectation as a result of those conversations is that some of that gets out into the more publicly accessible sustainability disclosures.
And I imagine whether it's a private meeting or your sustainability report, you need to have data to call on to have a good foundation to communicate and determine where you want to go. So
absolutely.
In terms of data collection, can you talk a bit about how you've seen companies do that? Is anyone doing that particularly well, where you're like, wow, I didn't know you were collecting all that. That's really useful.
Yeah, there's a couple of different elements. One is the data collection, and then perhaps the most relevant to our conversation today is how is that information being made available in a public way. And I think an interesting example to think about in that context is General Motors. As you can imagine, a company of that scale and complexity of a value chain. One thing that they have done is created an online database where external stakeholders, individual if you like, can self-identify, what are the metrics that are important to you, and then click through that and create a sort of a customized report that pulls out the areas of interest from their wealth of reporting. And so that's a way to help kind of boil down what might be an ocean of information into, what are the key kernels that are most relevant.
That is very interesting. And we'll put in the show notes online on sustainabilitydefined.com. We make an episode page for each episode. We'll put that site on there for anyone that wants to check that out. I wonder if GM, it could mean less inquiries to them, right? If they make this tool available, people aren't saying, well, can you give me a report with X, Y, and Z? It's like people can click and get it themselves. So I wonder if it has some side benefits as well.
Yeah, for sure. I'm sure it results in some, less frustrated stakeholders that, as you said, can find the information they need versus calling them up or emailing them and
more trust too, right? Like, oh, if you're making this easy, you must not have anything to hide.
Exactly. And again, it's not to say that they or really any of these companies have it all figured out.
Sure.
But creating some of that capability and resources helps stakeholders understand, what they've done and how they're doing it.
Got it. All right. So I love that example. Let's look more towards the future now. Are there any transparency-related initiatives that you're aware of that you're excited to see come about, or individual company actions on that front?
Yeah, there's your audience may be familiar with ISSB, that's the International Sustainability Standards Board. And that is an outgrowth of interest from G7 governments, the International Financial Reporting Standards, which puts out a lot of the guidance on global financial reporting to help make sense of what's really become a bit of an alphabet soup of standards and frameworks and platforms that's really becoming confusing for stakeholders and a huge burden on companies themselves. And so ISSB, this is an effort that launched at the end of 2021. They're coming out with frameworks and guidance this year that will help hopefully streamline some of that effort. So that's the area around, I think, growing harmonization. Similarly, and somewhat related to that, I think an area we're seeing in the transparency space is growing mandatory requirements. So, to date, a lot of what we've seen from companies has been voluntary disclosures, certainly encouraged and at times, pushed forward by investors and civil society organizations such as ours. But there's a growing mandatory requirements. Already from the EU, there's the CSRD, which is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that certainly governs EU companies, but also global companies that have meaningful footprints in Europe. That's requiring them to report to the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. So that's, I think, beginning to light a fire under companies. And, as we all have probably been following in varying degrees, our own SEC will be coming out with greenhouse gas reporting requirements in the second half of this year, which will also help make mandatory some of the climate disclosures we've been seeing. So there's a lot of movement on the mandatory space. There's a lot around hopefully helpful harmonization of different reporting. And then also, I think, a deepening of focus beyond climate, for very good reasons. Climate has been an essential area of focus for disclosure, transparency, and with the launch of TCFD, the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But obviously, that's a key piece of this, but not everything. And so there's a renewed focus on water and biodiversity with the TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, that's very intentionally modeled after TCFD, as well as science-based targets for nature. And really, we can't do, focus on climate for 5 years and then shift to biodiversity for 5 years and then shift to social justice issues. We really need to do this all at once, which is complicated, but necessary.
Now, it's important to not be tunnel visioned on carbon. Totally agree with you that. And Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, not only a popular movie, but seems to be what people seem to be saying what we need to do around climate.
Mhm.
And going back to the mandatory reporting point, are you finding that the companies in your network actually kind of like the mandatory reporting because it makes everyone have to jump in and creates a floor? Or are they kind of chafing against having requirements of what they have to disclose?
So I think the answer is yes. Say yes to both. There is, I think, an appreciation for, particularly for companies that might be out ahead, if they're committing a lot of time and resources. It would be helpful for all companies, or at least when you think about all, large companies, to be held to a similar standard. And so I think there is a lot of appreciation for the need for mandatory requirements. I think the flip side of that is always, devils in the details, and different companies, even different sectors, have different ideas about what they would like to see that mandatory floor, as you mentioned, be. But I do think that there is an appreciation for the benefit of having, some consistent requirements across the board.
And so anything you would suggest the listeners do to try to improve corporate transparency, even if they're not the heads of companies? What can individual listeners do on this topic?
Yeah, it's a good question. One, this may not be the sexiest answer, but digging in some of these disclosures of whatever companies you might be interested in, understand what they're doing, and if it raises questions, ask those questions, because companies they have their own priorities in mind, but they also, I think, are responsive when their stakeholders are calling for more information.
Like call them out on Twitter, or?
That's certainly a route you could take, but if there are, if you're looking at a report, there's always that kind of that comment field, or
an email address,
feedback field, and ask. It's great that you have such and such a policy in place, but how are you acting on this other aspect I'm not hearing? We're always trying to push companies to be more comprehensive, and one way for them to get that message is to hear it not just from organizations like Ceres, but to hear that from a broad range of stakeholders, including us all, as individuals. And so that's one way to think about it. If you have a 401k or a retirement plan, you could always, do that. Again, not the most sexy thing, but important thing about, voting your proxy when there's shareholder resolutions. Transparency and greater disclosure is something that's always coming up, particularly this time of year during annual general meetings. And so raising your voice that way, or have your organization raise that with whatever organization is their service provider for the 401k, that they can vote their shares. So there are a range of ways, from just being more inquisitive to kind of asking the questions of the companies you're interested in, and the retirement plans that you're participating in.
No, I appreciate you saying that your tips aren't all that sexy. That's very transparent of you, Dan. I will say, if any listeners do decide to go the Twitter route, tag us so we can see it and maybe help get some more eyeballs on it. So moving to our last question here, Dan. This is our traditional last question. So let's assume that we're with some friends, we're gathered around the computer, we're looking at these transparency reports, maybe getting individualized ones for us from GM of what we want to see. And someone comes up to us and says, "What are y'all doing?" And we explain, "Oh, we're looking at transparency and sustainability." And then we want to hit them with a fact around sustainability and transparency to get them interested in what we're doing. What would be that fact?
Sure. So here's a good one that'll probably turn all the heads at your next cocktail party.
That's what we want.
I mentioned the Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a focus, an effort that Ceres has been deeply involved in, that's looking at the 165 largest emitters globally. And of those 165 companies, through the work that a lot of the investors that we're engaging with have been doing, 75, so 3/4 of them, have a net zero commitment. And 92% of them have instituted some type of executive oversight, so at the board level or some of their senior management. Again, it's not to say that any of those companies have this all figured out, because there's a lot of work to be done, particularly in translating those commitments to actual action. But it's an important transparency step.
No, it's good to have those stats, and I appreciate you. That caveat is what I was thinking as well, of what percent have that action plan and have acted on it, and what's their progress and all that. And those are also important questions to ask. But I appreciate you, Dan, sharing your insights here, your experience with the network and before Ceres. So thank you for taking the time and for all that you're doing to help these big companies make these changes, because if they move, that has big impacts, but also what you're doing for the small and medium-sized enterprises.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to have this conversation, Scott. And it's also important, the work you're doing to help educate your audience to be aware of and dig deeply into these important questions.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
All right, take care.
All right, Definers, we are so excited to be joined by Kathy Mulvey, the Accountability Campaign Director within the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. So, Kathy, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to connect with us today.
Yeah, thanks, Jay and Scott. It's great to be here.
All right, so let's get started, Kathy, with your background. We saw you earned your bachelor's degree in English and French from the University of North Carolina.
You just couldn't pick one, Kathy. You had to do both.
That's right.
If I knew French, this is maybe where I'd try to toss it in, but we're going to steer clear of that. Kathy, any skills you learned from UNC within those degrees that are helpful to your current work at UCS? And perhaps was it in college that you got interested in corporate accountability in the first place?
Yeah, it certainly was in college that I got involved in social change organizing. And the issue that really got me involved was nuclear weapons. So I was a young person at the height of the Cold War, really terrified by the threat of nuclear holocaust. And among several issues that I learned to organize around at UNC, one was nuclear disarmament. And interestingly, that was my entry point to corporate accountability. Just a couple of years later, a campaign organized by the group that's now called Corporate Accountability, which was at the time InFact, which was taking on the industrial part of the military industrial complex with a campaign targeting GE as not only the leading producer of nuclear weapons components and delivery systems, but also the promoter of those weapons of mass destruction to our government. It was actually through my first organizing job that I came to really see the issues of transnational corporate globalization.
That's excellent, Kathy. Let's now transition to your role at Union of Concerned Scientists. So your title is Accountability Campaign Director within the Climate and Energy Program. Could you describe for us what your role entails and how you help guide engagement with corporate targets and mobilize experts and supporters to increase transparency and disclosure?
Sure. Yeah. So this campaign really specifically targets major fossil fuel companies. And in fact, within that, major investor-owned oil and gas companies have been our main focus of our work. So BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell in particular. And what I'm doing, and this is a recurring theme, but the work that I've done on corporate accountability across a range of issues has really been about reducing the political influence of corporations, the disproportionate influence that they have through their ability to spend money on advertising, on lobbyists and lobbying and political spending. Our campaign really sets about doing that by a couple of things. One, we're a science-based advocacy organization. So on fossil fuel companies, we have a long history of monitoring their disinformation and deception on climate science, dating back more than 15 years of watchdogging those communications and calling them out. And we continue to do that. The climate scientists that I work with have broke ground really in a sphere of climate attribution science that is really important to corporate accountability. That is the ability to quantify the contributions of particular fossil fuel polluters to global warming emissions. And then from that data set that was meticulously constructed by Richard Heady more than 10 years ago, to be able to quantify contributions to climate impacts such as global average temperature increase, sea level rise, ocean acidification, and most recently with a new study this month that quantifies the major carbon producers' contributions to wildfires in the Western U.S. and Canada.
Very topical, Kathy, I'll say, because today as we're recording this, I'm in Denver, and we've got and have had some smoke, coming down from fires in Alberta, just to the north. So spot on.
Yeah, well, we talked about in the introduction the investors as one of the pressure points to increase transparency. And I wonder, as you've enabled investors or as you've done your direct communications to these fossil fuel companies, what's been the reaction? I mean, have you seen any greater transparency? Some things maybe even that surprised you, like, oh, I didn't really expect them to disclose that, but they are, and that's great.
We've definitely seen more fossil fuel companies talking the talk, but not yet walking the walk. I think the most real significant example is that major investor-owned oil and gas companies now claim to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement, despite what they now claim that wasn't the case in the days immediately following the adoption of the Paris Agreement. I mean, many of them still use weasel words like aims or ambitions to be net zero by 2050, right? And that sounds pretty good.
What's an investor-owned? Is there a name we know, or are they smaller?
I'm talking BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil,
Okay.
Shell. And so the thing is, when you scratch beneath the surface, there are still some major gaps there. The biggest being, for example, that ExxonMobil, when it claims that it's aiming for net zero global warming emissions, it's actually leaving out about 85% of the emissions associated with its business, so-called Scope 3 emissions, right? The emissions that come from burning its products. So using its products exactly as they're intended to be used. And, the analogy here from my experience working in tobacco control would be like Philip Morris saying, well, yeah, sure. We produced and marketed and sold those cigarettes, but we didn't expect anybody to smoke them. So that's a big problem.
And are there any forthcoming corporate sustainability transparency initiatives you're working on that you can tell us about?
In our climate accountability campaign, one of the most exciting areas of work is our science hub for climate litigation. And this is seeking to catalyze science that is relevant to hold corporations and governments accountable for their role in climate change, and really building a community of scientists, legal experts, and practitioners who are working at that nexus of science and climate litigation. The work of the Science Hub for Climate Litigation is really important to transparency because litigation is one of the levers that we have to bring corporate actions and the inner workings of companies into the public eye. We saw with the widespread litigation against the tobacco industry in the 1990s, one of the results of those lawsuits through a settlement agreement was the release of millions of pages of previously secret internal documents that the corporations wanted to keep hidden. So with climate accountability lawsuits proceeding now against the major fossil fuel polluters, seeking to hold them accountable for climate damages and fraud. One of the things we really need is a clear picture into what they knew, what they did, and what they are doing today. The Union of Concerned Scientists' work in relation to climate litigation is really valuable.
No, I get it. And, some people might be like, oh, a whole court case, legal action, but sometimes it's not even about the result per se. There's disclosures that have to be made, and also then articles get written once that legal action is brought. So I think it makes total sense with the importance of that lever. Let's move to our last question here. So let's say that we're looking at some of these transparency reports, and maybe we're sitting with a friend looking over some of these disclosures, and someone comes over and joins us, and we want to impress them with one fact about corporate sustainability transparency. What would that fact be?
So here's the fun fact, and it's not so fun, that since the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, the world's 60 largest banks have spent $5.5 trillion on fossil fuel financing.
And that's with you watchdogging them.
Well, that's with a lot of folks. That stat is from Banking on Climate Chaos, which is put together by a bunch of great organizations.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's more work to do here to bring this out into the open.
All right. Well, thanks, Kathy, what you're doing to watchdog those fossil fuel companies and others to do the right thing, give us more information, and hopefully then we can act accordingly, and so can they.
Sounds great. Thank you, Scott.
All right. Thanks, Kathy.
All right, Scott, I know we end all of these episodes with a bad joke, but for the sake of transparency here, I've got nothing today, so I think we can just roll right through it.
I thought you were going to say, for the sake of transparency, I really need to pee. Let's just wrap this up. Something like that.
I'm not saying that's not true, Scott.
You just use an excuse to not think of a bad joke.
This topic lent itself to me in that regard, so I'm just going to take advantage of it.
Okay. I guess respect on that front. So let's do some thank yous. Taylor Price, huge research help. Thank you for doing that. Keaton Butler, thank you for the expert editing per usual. And Jay, tell the listeners what we really hope they'll do.
That's right, Scott. So we got to ask folks to rate, review, and subscribe to the show where they get their podcasts, and placing special emphasis on leaving us a written review. We know not all podcast platforms allow you to do that, but they greatly help us show up in search functions. So from here on out, we won't read any dated reviews. We'll only save this spot for new ones that come in. So folks, here's your little elbow to do so and have your name and review read live.
It makes us feel good. It's fun, but we can't do it without new reviews. So please take a moment to do that. We'd appreciate it. And with that, Jay, I think that about does it. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.